Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us again this week. Really excited about our guest today. I'm going to let Amos take it away and go ahead and jump straight into intros and a discussion about Brad's new book.
Cool. Well, thanks, everybody. It's great to see you all again. And, I think we have a person who needs little introduction, but very excited to have Brad Feld with us here today. We're using his most recent book, The Entrepreneur's Weekly Nietzsche, as sort of a starting point for the conversation. But knowing Brad and I suspect that we will likely have a fun time meandering all over the place. So I'm also going to be monitoring the questions. If you have questions, please put them in Ask a Question. And then, we'll make this as much of a conversation as we possibly can. But what I thought I would do is, I'll allow Brad to, briefly introduce himself. And then I'd love to hear your words of the what and the why behind the Weekly Nietzsche.
Hi, everyone. And Amos, is always wonderful to spend time with you. I'm Brad Feld. I'm a partner at Foundry Group, which is a venture firm that invests in early stage tech companies all across the U.S. We also invest in a bunch of early stage funds. We've got about 40 funds we've invested in. I also am one of the co-founders of Techstars. So I've been involved from the very beginning in all things Techstars, and just sort of delighted and honored and super psyched about all the people I've gotten to work with, both inside Techstars and the many founders all across the world. And, it's just one of those things that's been a real joy. So that's what I've been doing for a long time. Prior to that, I was an entrepreneur and ran my own company that I sold to a public company in 1993. I live mostly in Colorado. I split my time between the Aspen area and the Boulder area. But my wife grew up in Homer, Alaska. So we also spent some time up in Alaska. I've written a bunch of books. This is the first book that I hope takes me on a journey away from the first half a dozen or so books that I wrote, which were mostly functional around different aspects of entrepreneurship, although one of them was a little bit philosophical. A book that some of you may know, probably the most popular book that I'd written, is a book called Venture Deals. And it was written in 2011, basically about how to do venture capital deals. And it was written at a time well before anybody was really talking about early stage investment in any significant way. We were just coming out of the global recession or financial crisis or whatever it's called, back with the benefit of a decade of history. And that book today is in its fourth edition, but it's not a technical legal book, but it's very much about sort of all aspects of doing a venture capital investment, raising a pre-seed or seed stage round. A pair of books that I wrote that are sort of a little bit more philosophical, but still very functional were a book in 2012 called Startup Communities, and a book last year called The Startup Community Way that was a sequel. That really, the phrase startup communities didn't exist before that. And I worked hard to define this notion of a startup community with a very deeply held belief that I had that you could create startup communities all over the world. And in fact, it was critical for any city with at least 100,000 people to build a vibrant startup community as part of it for its long-term health. If I time travel back to 2010, when I was first started working on this idea, and I just think about Austin, right? I mean, Amos, what was Austin like in 2010? It wasn't like this crazy, vibrant community that it is today.
No, it wasn't. In fact, I didn't live here yet. Did I live here? No, I did live here in 2010. But when I first started coming here in 2000, I remember very distinctly, I would stay at a hotel that's now called The Line. It was called something else. And I would walk 4 blocks to the Hot Jobs office, and there was nothing. And now you can't even park downtown, and it's vibrant. It's crazy how much it has grown.
Yeah. So, I've been on that, but again, a lot of functional stuff versus more philosophical stuff. With this book, I wrote it with a guy named Dave Jilk, who was my first business partner. in my first company. We ran a company together for 7 years. He's still 35 years later, one of my closest friends. And we've done a number of things over the years, but we'd really stopped working on any projects of substance until we did this book together. It began with Dave, who's semi-retired. He still has a company that he owns and runs part-time. He likes to say that in the summers, his job is to hike around Colorado. And, he writes papers on AI and does fundamental research, but he's sort of at that stage. And about 2013, 14, as we were spending lots of time together, on weekends with our wives, he had gone very, very deep on philosophy as kind of a hobby. He decided he was going to read a bunch of different philosophers, and his way of approaching it is to read the source material and spend a lot of time with the source material. So as he's kind of reading, fundamental works from different philosophers, he starts tossing Nietzsche quotes at me. And, he'd say, "Hey, Brad, does this quote kind of sound like entrepreneurship?" And he'd toss a Nietzsche quote at me. It was kind of, rhetorical question because he knew my answer was probably going to be yes. And he has a very funny moment that he likes to describe where he did it a couple of times in a row. And I was reading a book, and each time I said, and didn't even look up, like I was just giving him the automatic response. But it had some appeal. And we started talking about Nietzsche as a philosopher who is a extremely, extremely important philosopher, but also an extraordinarily misunderstood philosopher, especially because of some of the organizations over the years that have co-opted or tried to co-opt some of Nietzsche's work as sort of their principles. And they've done it in, I would say, very ham-handed ways and very inauthentic in terms of the actual dynamics around Nietzsche. So a specific example is that a lot of people's reaction, and frankly, my first reaction when Dave told me about Nietzsche, is I said, "Isn't that the Nazi German philosopher?" Because there's this sort of history and tangle of Nietzsche with the Nazis. We have a section at the end of the book, which is basically deconstructing. It's about 10 pages. It deconstructs a bunch of these incorrect perceptions of Nietzsche, and gives sort of the factual background behind what happened. Sort of more contemporaneously, I would say there was a segment of time, maybe 2017, 18, where the alt-right really became associated with Nietzsche, or vice versa. I would say Nietzsche got associated with the alt-right. Again, complete nonsense. And if you actually do the work and understand what's happening, it's kind of like one Nietzsche quote misinterpreted being used over and over and over again. So this was fascinating to me because it's something that happens a lot in our society, especially with entrepreneurs, is that they end up being very provocative, but very misunderstood. So as Dave and I went deeper and deeper into Nietzsche, we started to really realize that Nietzsche was essentially the disruptor of his time in the context of the transition from classical, mostly European, but not entirely, but classical Western philosophy to contemporary Western philosophy. Nietzsche was 1860 to 1880. He mid 1880s, he went crazy by 1890 and had died by 1900. But his sort of body of work that he did in that time period was really, really provocative, transformative, unique, in the same way that entrepreneurs are provocative, transformative, and unique with what they do. And he also had a very clear kind of mission that he was trying to get to in terms of understanding. I'll sort of end this intro with this notion that I had some friends and colleagues that I knew had studied philosophy, and I reached out to them when we started working on this book, mostly just as an edge test of some of my assumptions, but also to calibrate, like, am I missing something obvious here in terms of bad, or am I missing something obvious here in terms of good? And the response I got was pretty consistently positive, and in some cases resoundingly positive. And an example I'll give is Reid Hoffman, who wrote the foreword. Reid studied philosophy at Oxford, and for master's degree. And if anybody's ever spent any time or watched Reed or read anything about Reed, you know that he's a very philosophical thinker, in addition to being an extraordinarily successful entrepreneur. And like his immediate reaction was effusive. And he coined the phrase that Nietzsche is the patron philosopher of entrepreneurs, because of this parallel between what Nietzsche did in his world and how he thought and how he engaged, and how an entrepreneur does. And in fact, if Nietzsche was a contemporary of all of us, my guess is that there'd be a pretty good chance that he'd be an entrepreneur. I'm going to shift my seat so I'm not in the sun quite so much.
That's really interesting, and it actually makes this question might be technical a little bit, but I'm super curious, especially as the way that you described it. As you were writing the book, was there a chapter that was both most fun to write, and was there a chapter that was the hardest to write? And perhaps they were even the same chapter.
Yeah, there wasn't a specific. I've got a couple that are ones that I really like, and I'll just mention a few. But the book itself was an interesting experience. So sort of the meta was harder. The way we approached it, and if you have a copy or get a copy of the book, what you'll see is that we were inspired by Ryan Holiday, who lives in Austin. And Amos, I don't know if you know Ryan, but Ryan's a good friend. If you ever want to connect with Ryan, tell me. He's a delightful guy. And actually, you should, given the books that you've written. So write it down as a thing to follow up on after this. And Ryan now has a bookstore. It's one of his hobbies in Austin. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called like the Corner Books or the Corner Store or something. But Ryan inspired me through his writing around Stoicism. And he'd written a number of books. And one of my favorites of his, although all of his books are quite interesting, he wrote a book that's called The Daily Stoic, which is 365 Stoic quotes, from people like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and others. And it's a quote, and then he sort of writes an essay about the quote and how it relates to contemporary life. And it's not focused on entrepreneurs per se, but it's very relevant to entrepreneurs of business. And I have a copy. I have several houses. I have a copy in the bathroom, the master bathroom in each house. And when I do my morning evacuation, I read whatever the day's thing is. And it's not a quote of the day calendar. It's much deeper than that. And it's really for reflection, to read the quote, to read what Ryan says. I go back and read the quote again, and then I just sort of carry it around with me. And I've probably read the book from beginning to end now 3 or 4 times a day at a time. So I was inspired by that. And as Dave and I started talking about doing a book, my reaction was, gosh, I can't imagine trying to do that with 365 Nietzsche quotes. But let's do one a week, right? Like 52 is a good number. That's a lot of quotes. And we did it a little more substantively around each of the quotes. And what we did was we took Nietzsche's quote, which, by the way, are, translations into English of German in the 1800s. And most of the translations are early 1900s to mid 1900s translation, because we wanted to not have to get rights clearance for any of it. So we used quotes that were public domain. And as we read the quote translation, our reaction over and over again was, what the quote was. It was like, whew, there's a lot in that. I mean, they're beautiful, but like, what is it saying? Which is part of the power of this book. Is the goal is not to give you an answer, it's to make you think. We then transliterated into English of 2020 what the Nietzsche quote was. So we took the original translation, we then wrote our transliteration or translation of that, and with an application to entrepreneurship, not exclusively, but with a focus on that. We then wrote a couple of page essay, and our essays were in some ways similar to Ryan's and in some ways different. One of the big differences, and it's part of the difference between Nietzsche and the Stoics, is a lot of the Stoic philosophy is directive. It's very specific, sort of things to do, ways to live, ways to be. For us, we view Nietzsche less as that and much more as a provocateur, someone who makes you think about what's going on in your own context. And as people who are entrepreneurs and who's now investors and spend an enormous amount of time with entrepreneurs, it's often an exercised a resource in the context of the leader or the entrepreneur to reflect on themselves and reflect on the context in which they're in versus just be obsessed and completely focused on their business. And so the essays tend to be provocative. They have some suggestions from our experience, but they often have lots of questions and try to provoke. And then about, I don't know, 2/3 of the chapters or 2/3 of the weeks have another 2 or so page essay from an entrepreneur that is their application to themselves and their experience of that quote. So we didn't give them guidance. We didn't say what we wanted them to write. We just said, write it like a blog post. We're not going to heavily edit it. Maybe we'll fix where your commas go if you put them in the wrong place with regard to quotation marks and things like that. But we're going to keep it informal and light, your words, whatever you want to talk about. And in a lot of cases, what was written did not necessarily match up with our stuff, but it was additive. And in a few cases, interestingly, it was contradictory in a way that was quite good. And then we tuned the text to sort of incorporate it. So it wasn't like we write, hey, think about A, and the person says, A is bullshit, you should think about B. Like, we didn't do that. We tried to link it together. That's the book. And the idea is you could read it from beginning to end. You could read it a week at a time, a couple of pages, and reflect on it. I actually find that when I've gone back and reread it, I always read every book I write in one time all the way through after it comes out in hard copy. I just read the hard copy to really just cement it. But I've gone back, and as I continue to go back to the book and look at stuff, I often will read the translation that we have of the quote first. And then I read the quote. And then I read the translation again, which sort of locks the thing in my mind. And then I start reading the rest of it. Because the beauty of Nietzsche is not that he's saying, do A. The beauty is he has this magnificent way with language that pushes you to think about A, but maybe from a frame of reference that's different than what you're used to. I'll answer the question Amos asked. I'm just looking up. I want to read it exactly. One of my favorite chapters, I wrote a post about it a while ago, is a chapter we call Monsters. And in Monsters, I'll just read the Nietzsche quote. And just think about it. He who fights with monsters should be careful, lest he thereby become a monster. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee. And I'm thinking of a very specific conversation Amos and I had. I don't have any idea, Amos, whether you're comfortable sharing any of it or not.
I share everything. Go for it. Yeah.
So, you called me one day about a deal, a financing that had happened where the investors had decided after they'd closed this major financing, and I don't remember the exact details, that they were going to withdraw, that they wanted their money back and they didn't want to do the deal anymore.
Yep.
And it had been exercised in kind of a dramatic and painful way. You expressed your views about what was going on, and we're sort of looking for what are my real options here at this stage. And I don't remember exactly what I said, but I do imagine that part of, and again, interpret this quote, I'll read it again and then sort of play it back for everybody. My guess is that there was some interpretation or some way that I said, look, view it in the category of shit happens. You can fight to the death to try to get to something, but do you really want to do that? And if you do, go for it. But do you really want to do that? Is that really the essence of what you are and who you are and how you are in the context of what's going on with these people who clearly, did not behave from your frame of reference as either good partners or honorable partners or whatever? And again, I'm not making a judgment about the specific situation because I don't have enough data to know, but from my interaction with you, based on sort of your perspective, he who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee. Think about that in contemporary life. Does that ring true with that experience at all?
It does, Brad, on so many levels. And it's something that's been over a year now. It's been almost a year and a half now. I don't think there's certainly not a month and not a week that has gone by that I haven't thought about that. And I have an executive coach who doubles as a therapist for me. And we've spent a lot of time exploring that, and I think I'd like to think that it has actually sent me in the other direction, which is how to not be a monster.
Well said.
Yeah.
Let me give you another one that I really like. It's and it's one, you asked about one that was hard to write,
mm-hmm.
and there's a fun story behind this one too. So I'll describe the story. The quote itself is, or the chapter title is Obsession. And let me read, I'm going to go ahead and read Nietzsche, and then I'll give our translation. This is a little bit of a longer one, and I'll try to read it with the right cadence. Again, the title of the chapter is Obsession. The passion which seizes the noble man is a peculiarity without his knowing that it is so. The use of a rare and singular measuring rod, almost a frenzy, the feeling of heat in things that feel cold to all other persons, a divining of values for which scales have not yet been invented, a sacrifice on altars which are consecrated to an unknown God, a bravery without the desire for honor, a self-sufficiency which has superabundance and imparts to men and things. Our translation is, in other words, a noble man has exceptional passion, but does not realize just how unusual it is. He has high standards for success, enthusiasm for things that others find dull, a sense of what will be valuable in the future, intense but unexplained motivations, courage without the need for praise, and the ability to sustain and revel in this intensity without support for others. So that was a lot. Let me pause, and I want to just go back, and I'm going to read the first little bit of what we wrote, and I'm going to tell a quick story. You may have noticed that this chapter is titled Obsession, but Nietzsche seems to be talking about passion. For several years, Brad has written and spoken about the pitfalls of passion in entrepreneurship, distinguishing it from obsession, which is a quality he looks for, and on and on and on. Okay, so I'm not going to keep reading it, but we hit that. I mean, Dave and I got to this place, and I'm like, Dave, I mean, what Nietzsche wrote is not about passion. It has nothing to do with passion. It's obsession. He's using the wrong word. Dave is an engineer. And his response to me was, you're wrong. We argued about it for a while. And I said, I don't know, it's hard. And we wrote, we co-wrote the essay, and we tidied it up, and we went back and changed it. And then one day Dave sent me an email, and here's what we wrote in the book, not about the email he sent, but about the specific thing. Dictionaries generally speak of passion as a strong emotion, while obsession is a preoccupation of the mind. We have a hunch that Nietzsche is trying to make a similar distinction here. The word obsession did not come into common use until later. Earlier in the text, he says, what then makes a person noble? Certainly not that he generally follows his passions. There are contemptible passions. It is worth asking yourself whether you're obsessed with your business and the problem it solves, or merely passionate about it. And we go on and on, right? This was part of the powerful, powerful thing for us about writing the book. And one of the things I hope for people reading the book. A decade ago, basically had a throwaway line. I said, look, I don't care about founders who are passionate. That's a cliche. I'm tired of that cliche. I think an extrovert could be passionate about a loaf of bread. This is the most amazing loaf of bread ever in the history of loaf of bread. And it has nothing to do with entrepreneurship or the business. It has to do with personality and style and enthusiasm. I also think it's incredibly easy to fake passion. If you're a certain personality type, I think there's a lot of personality types. It's very difficult to be passionate about anything. And so passion ends up being a really poor indexer in the context of one. Obsession, on the other hand, there's healthy characteristics and there's unhealthy characteristics. And we can spend a lot of time talking about the unhealthy characteristics of obsession, but obsession also does have healthy characteristics. And for me, that was the feedback loop that I saw amongst entrepreneurs I wanted to work with. When it was a throwaway line in talks and stuff, I would say things like, I think passion's the wrong word. It's, it's too easy to fake passion, da, 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 da. And then I would say, I'm really looking for entrepreneurs who are obsessed. And over time, as people sort of struggled with the easy the positive obsession versus the negative obsession, I changed it. I still use the word obsession, but I said obsession to me is answering the question enthusiastically, yes, hell yes, in the hell yes, hell no decision framework, to the question, was I put on this planet to work on this thing? Am I doing the thing that I was put on this planet to do? And it might not be for your whole life, but in this moment. And that's obsession. That has nothing to do with passion. And as Dave and I talked about that more and unfolded it more, we really came back to it. I'm going to end this section with reading back the Nietzsche quote to you, because I just want you to see how rich this quote is. And, this is not two college kids sitting up at 4:00 in the morning, stoned again, talking about stuff. This is two people who have a lot of life experience, good and bad, who are trying to map their own experiences, me and Dave, our own experiences and our own value system in a way that we can clearly put it out into the world in a way that's potentially provocative and helpful for other people to think about. So let's go back to the quote. Bring it up. Not a good memorizer, so I don't even try anymore. Again, obsession. The passion. And actually, maybe I'll just substitute the word obsession for passion here. The obsession which seizes the noble man is a peculiarity without his knowing that it is so. The use of a rare and singular measuring rod, almost a frenzy, the feeling of heat in things that feel cold to all other persons, a divining of values for which scales have not yet been invented, a sacrificing on altars which are consecrated to an unknown God, a bravery without the desire for honor, a self-sufficiency which has superabundance and imparts to men and things. Now, last comment on this, you got to time travel back to the mid to late 1800s. And, if you study any history, right, it was the end of the Age of Enlightenment. It was still kind of before the Industrial Revolution, beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the US, around Civil War, post-Civil War timeframe. I mean, these are remarkable words for a philosopher. In a positive way, a sacrificing on altars which are consecrated to an unknown God. Heresy. Hang that man up. And yet it rings so true in the context of the entrepreneur and what the entrepreneur is doing and has to go through to be successful.
That's first of all, it's an amazing quote. And I have a question for you based on what you just said. I have not thought about the difference between passion and obsession in the way that you described it before. But the first thought that I had, what reminded me actually of a Rush song, which is "Show Me, Don't Tell Me," and I wonder if that's a difference between passion and obsession. Passion is I can tell you all day long how I feel, but obsession is I'm doing the thing.
Great modern reference. Thing number one, I'm a huge Rush fan. When I'm a very long distance runner. I don't care about mileage anymore because I'm slow. I run for 2, 3, 4 hours at a time. And when I'm in a lull, one of my standards to pick me up is Rush, and Neil Peart with the endless rhythmic drum beat is perfect because like you can't help but get into whatever the rhythm is.
Get in a trance, yeah.
Well, and that's show don't tell is part of the Techstars mantra and lore too. If you go back to the book David Cohen and I wrote, which was the very first book I wrote, which was Do More Faster. In that book, we had a whole thing about show not tell, and the early demo day and dynamics around Techstars is really helping codify this notion. I mean, even then in 2007, when we ran our first demo day, that was not the way people pitched. And I think the show don't tell pitch approach was key, but it's foundational. I mean, I spend a lot of time, and we all do in our worlds, telling people what's going on. Right. I had a call this morning for 30 minutes. I had 30 minutes with a potential investor in a company, and we hadn't met before, and we got introduced, and he wanted to hear more. And I mean, I'm telling him, I can't show him in that 15 minutes anything. But even if you had recorded the 15 minutes of me, trying to explain to him why he should care about this company and why he should engage, there was a lot more show language than tell language. There was a lot more examples than bullet points. There was a lot more me in real time tying what I was saying back to what he had told me about what he's doing and what he's interested in. And so shallow example, because it was still a telling situation, but that link is true. Now I would describe myself, I'm an introvert. I love this kind of interaction with people where I don't actually have to physically get together with anybody. And as I've gotten older, I've embraced the way I feel more. And when I say I'm an introvert, it's mostly about how I feel in terms of how I am with others. I like having remote digital electronic interaction with people. I don't like being physically in the same space as other people. And personally, if it's more than 4 people in the same physical space, it takes energy away from me versus give me energy. That's how I define the distinction. However, in the context of my work, for the last 35 years as an entrepreneur and investor, so much of the work has to be with other people, especially as an investor. And so one of the things that I've worked hard at is being very, very comfortable extemporaneously from a non-physical context, being able to engage around what's going on rather than try to tell people. And today might be a useful sort of self-referential view of that. I don't have a script that I'm giving you. I don't have a book talk that I'm doing. And in fact, if you go look at YouTube, there's probably, I don't know, a bunch of the Nietzsche talks or podcasts that I've done a Nietzsche talk on, or any of the other things I've ever done a talk on. You will see that 100% of them are extemporaneous. And the vast majority of them are AMA type approaches where I don't structure it. I didn't say to Amos, let's prepare the questions and let's go through the questions and Amos can ask me a question about anything he wants. And at any point, if he hands over the questions to y'all can ask me questions about anything you want. And that's because I'm obsessed about this notion of what the entrepreneurial context is. I would say that the dynamics of what I'm obsessed about in terms of my work, you used the word why at the beginning. What was my why for writing this book? In 2010, I couldn't say this then, but I can say this looking back. So with the benefit of 11 years of hindsight, my why in 2010 was that I wanted to, I'm going to underscore the words that are key. I wanted to help democratize entrepreneurship globally. That was my why. Help, the help word was key. It wasn't me. I wanted to help democratize entrepreneurship globally. In 2021, that is no longer my why. I realized that this summer when I took a sabbatical. I took 5 weeks off. It's not my why because it's been done. Entrepreneurship's democratized globally. Yeah, there's plenty of stuff to do around that construct. But it's no longer a thing that I'm in a place where I'm providing something that's foundationally unique in terms of how to do that. And that's an interesting thing. I'm 55, about to turn 56. Like, what does that mean? And how do you do that? And as an entrepreneur myself, whether you want to call me an entrepreneur or investor, doesn't matter to me. What am I obsessed about? What is my why for the next arc of whatever that is, against the backdrop of the experiences I've had, the success I've had, the things, the failures that I've had, the things that I enjoy doing, the things that I don't enjoy doing, the constraints, whatever, right? And it's one of the things that, again, this book, I think I wouldn't have got to that point without writing this book with Dave. It's not the only thing that got me to this point. I would suggest that the last probably 15 months of my own therapy has been really profound in terms of this, because of my ability to go deeper on a set of things. I think COVID and the experience of COVID has been very profound on my own sort of thinking and reaction to this. And I also think my wife, Amy, and, she's the same age as I am. And just, the working through this notion that our experience, our existence is finite, having parents and friends' parents get older or pass away, having contemporaries get ill or pass away, having, at 55, I can't run like I could run when I was 25. When I go for a 3-hour run, I don't recover quite the same way that I did when I was younger. All of these things sort of coming back to this question of what is it that I was put on this planet that's at the bottom of a gravity well, circling a nuclear, on top of like molten lava, circling a nuclear reactor at the edge of this galaxy that's a tiny little galaxy in what is now, the perceived known universe, which of course, if you believe in the multiple universe theory, is just one of an infinite number of universes. Like, the fuck? Like, how are you spending your time? And one of the things I would say, like this book and the writing that I do today and the thing, it's not going to give you the answer to any of that. I don't have your answer. But I sure hope that some of what I can do at this stage is help prompt more deeper thinking. I'm not saying that, somebody said to me, "Hey, Brad, do you care about like success of businesses and that anymore?" I'm like, yeah, of course. Like that's an outcome from spending your time in a context that you care about. Do I care about how successful I am relative to somebody else? No fucking way. Do I care about how much money I've made relative to somebody else? Nah. Do I care about how I describe my successes and my failures relative to anybody else, or what somebody else externally writes about me? Nah. Like, I've worked through those things. Do I have any ego attachment to anything? Oh yeah, we all do. Do I have any flaws? Got tons of them. Am I fucked up on any dimensions? Oh yeah. And it's much more of the, like, now feels like such a powerful time to dig deeper into those things individually, especially now that entrepreneurship is a global phenomena and it's tightly integrated into so many of the things that are going to be transformative about our experience as human beings over the next 20 or 30 years.
Awesome. I like 14 questions popped in my head while you were chatting, and you answered like 11 of them in that process.
Good. Yeah, I'm working on the ESP thing. I don't quite got it, but I'm working.
It's working. I do have a list of a bunch more questions, but we have a couple that popped up. So I'm gonna start with looking at these. So the first one is, Brad, how do you balance being a futuristic founder when dealing with stagnant VCs and non-innovative money?
That will never change. Like, that is just I mean, that's a challenge. How did Nietzsche deal with being an innovative philosopher in 1870 when everybody said, gosh, philosophers write these long treatises with lots of references to other philosophers. They don't write poetry, right? This isn't philosophy. It's poetry. This is garbage. And in fact, it's some of the most amazing stuff that's, in the stanzas that he wrote. Yeah. And, dismissed because, well, of course, philosophers aren't poets. But for me, I think that one of the interesting things, and again, I'll switch because I realize that I'm totally in the sun again. The joy of being outside, but also having the sun move around. One of the things that I think is really powerful in the context of an individual in life, especially an entrepreneur, is you are defining the context in which you and your company are operating in. I, by the way, hate the word culture. I try not to use the word culture. I like the phrase cultural norms. The reason I use the phrase instead of the word is the phrase makes you define your cultural norms versus label things as culture. And I think when you label things as culture, it's super easy to be lazy. It's super easy to label stuff that has nothing to do with culture. It's super easy to get cause and effect confused. And frankly, one of the joys of entrepreneurship is being able to, as founders, define your cultural norms. And then as your company grows, evolve and develop your cultural norms. To the question specifically, it doesn't matter what scale or size your company is, you're always going to have people around your company, whether they're investors or employees or customers, who don't necessarily share your cultural norms. They also, in many cases, don't have the same motivation that you have as founders for what you're trying to do. And this especially appears in a part of the cycle we're in, where there's enormous amounts of money being raised and money being made, where so much of the cultural norm of entrepreneurship is around economic reward and success, rather than fundamental innovation or fundamental transformation of things or disruption of things. That's not judgment. That's not saying that either is better than the other. They're just different things. And when they combine, it's often can be very frustrating for the entrepreneur, because the person who is on the side of the economic reward is, in a lot of ways, not obsessed about the thing that's happening. They're just focused on the economic reward. Whereas the entrepreneur, again, I was placed on planet Earth to work on this thing. She is going to be obsessed about what she's working on. The money, the investors, or the people around are looking at that as a resource for them to accomplish what they have as goals. And I think it's just sort of accepting that the goals of an investor, what they are trying to accomplish, or again, other stakeholders may not align with your obsessed focus. That's not necessarily a bad thing as long as you understand that and don't have the wrong expectations around it. Here's an example of the wrong expectations. I'm sure everybody that's ever raised any money has encountered a really, really great, an investor who is really great at selling himself and selling his firm and selling why they will be the best possible investor for the entrepreneur. And the entrepreneur, the founders, you got a founding team, chooses that investor. And after the investment is done, realizes that it was all bullshit. It was all a sales pitch. That actually that's not connected to what that investor is going to do or how that investor is going to act. Now, there are plenty of cases where it's not bullshit, where it's actually what happens and what is the capability and value system of the investor. Obviously, the question leaned to the not positive case. And my best suggestion, maybe in the end, is to just accept the reality and to do your best job of choosing people who are aligned with what you're trying to do, aligned with your cultural norms, aligned with what, your goals are, but not necessarily fall into the trap of believing that everyone needs to have the same conceptual framing around the problem that you do, and that their goals and motivations may be radically different.
That's great. And I think it's, something that I've thought for a long time that I think aligns with this, and feel free to react to it, or I can move to another question, which is, I think that there's a belief out there that the number one goal of every investor is to help a founder build their vision of the future. And I don't know that I believe that to be true. I think, right, their job is literally to take $1 and to find companies to invest in to make $2 or $3 or $4. And in doing so, they're hopefully enabling that, but not necessarily directly aligned, which I think is what you're saying.
Super important what you just said. For many, many years, I've told people my job as a venture capitalist is extraordinarily straightforward. I have investors who give me a box of money, and my job is to give them back a bigger box of money over time. That's it. All the rest of it's how I do my job. That's my job. And what Amos what you just said is exactly that. Like, there are many, 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 many different legal, there are some illegal, but many, many different legal ways to take a box of money and invest it in companies to generate a bigger box of money. And by the way, there's also a lot of investors who are not particularly good at that and struggle to generate a bigger box of money or generate a smaller box of money. And there's all kinds of noise around that. And so it's not about what the job of the investor is. That's simple. It's how they do the job and how the firm does the job. And now we're in show don't tell again. It's very easy to say, I'm a value-added venture capitalist and I support entrepreneurs and my goal is to be founder friendly and be entrepreneur first and whatever. I mean, there's so much language you could throw at that. Great. But show me how you've done that with others. And let me understand that from a show perspective, not from a you're telling me perspective. A very simple little hint as a way of sort of separating people between show and tell language. Negative is when people use modifiers to describe what they are. Positive is when they use stories to describe what they are. Very simple. A modifier is, I'll give one. I'm a VC, has no modifier. I'm an investor, has no modifier. I'm a value-added VC. Like, my first reaction when somebody says that is to wonder whether they're value-added. I don't immediately dismiss them as not, but I don't immediately say, oh yeah, of course you're value-added because you stated it. I look at it and I'm like, okay, I'm going to check that because you're feeling the need to modify and tell me what you are. We are, the friendliest firm when it comes to investing in first-time founders. Okay. How about giving me a list of all the first-time founders that you've invested in, successful and unsuccessful, and let me go find out for myself now that you've pointed out that that's something that you need to modify. Yeah. So looking for things like that, again, in the context of it is so powerful. As an entrepreneur, you can say, yeah, lots of stuff. And my comment is, I'm not saying these are things you should do. I'm suggesting that these are things to think about, to incorporate into the way you approach what's going on around you versus just, take at face value what's happening around you.
Yeah, awesome. We have time for one more question, and I think there's one that is a really fitting, potentially final question, which I'm just going to read out, and it's in the chat too on the side, so you'll be able to see it. It's from Dan Driscoll. Do you think Nietzsche would say an obsessed founder gets more personal satisfaction from the journey, building a company, trying to solve a problem, or the destination, some type of exit, successfully solving the problem?
I think Nietzsche would definitely be a journey, not the outcome person. Although I don't think there's plenty of stuff in Nietzsche that links to outcomes. Let me try to find one really quickly that I think is a great quote if I can pull it up quickly. Yeah. And I think this kind of answers the question. It's another one that's in my favorites category. The chapter is called Hitting Bottom. The Nietzsche quote is, "Whence come the highest mountains? So did I once ask. Then I learned that they come out of the sea. The testimony is inscribed on their stones and on the walls of their summits. Out of the deepest must the highest come to its heights." In other words, I wondered where the highest mountains come from. I learned that they come out of the sea. The evidence is in their rocks and on their summit walls. The highest things must start very low. And, if you tie it, Dan, to your comment, he is talking about outcomes, right? The highest mountains. But if you go back to it, he says, whence come the highest mountains? So did I once ask. So he used to think about the highest mountains. And then once he learned that they came out of the sea, he started focusing on this incredible journey they had to go through. And again, is it an either or question? I don't know, but that relationship is so key. You see that through a bunch of the other quotes, is that it's not the journey is the reward. I mean, that's such a cliche. Is it, if you build a business for 10 years, I'll end with a story of a friend, and how he turned into a business failure into a life success because of the journey. I was on his board for 15 years or so. He ran the company for 17 years. He built the company from nothing, him and a founder. At the peak, they were about a $10 million business making money. They had 100 employees. This was, back when a $10 million business was something people looked at and said, that's a pretty good business. Now, how are you going to get to 25? Not that's only a $10 million business. It's a Series A investment. He never was able to really get the business growing beyond that size. He had dependency on a couple of partners that were very large companies that really did not respect their partner channel very well, used their partner channel, very classical thing that happened in the time frame that he was running his business, which was, I would say, the mid-90s, early to mid-90s through 2000 and, 6, 7, 8 time frame. The business eventually went out of business. We tried to sell the business multiple times, could never get anybody to buy the business. In the end, just, wound the business down. That was really hard at many, many levels. And by the way, he was a beloved CEO. The people who worked for him loved working for him. The company did a great job for its customers. It just couldn't, and it started as a service business. It just couldn't get out of the escape velocity of being a service business into a product business, which is what it had tried to do for many years. We were having a conversation, we're still good friends, having a conversation maybe 6 months after he wound the business down. And it was something about how was he doing? And I can't remember the phrase I used, but I said something about failure. I used the word failure in some context. And he said, Brad, I really no longer view the experience as a failure. I view it as a financial failure. You invested in this company, a bunch of other people invested in this company. We ran this company for 17 years. And in the end, it was a financial failure. My investors, my shareholders, and I didn't get an economic return from the investment. But it wasn't a failure. Over the 17 years, we employed 1,000 plus people. We worked for, we did work for, again, I don't know the number, 1,000 companies. We had, of the relationships developed over that time, there were 100 people who worked at the company who met their spouse and had a baby while at the company. So there were 100 babies born during that period of time. He gave some number of hundreds of friendships developed that were lifelong friendships. There were, by the time, we were talking, there'd been about a dozen or so companies that people had gone and started off as co-founders of other companies. So he said, so far, there's been another dozen or so companies that have been started out of people that worked at this company. He said, I was gainfully employed for 17 years. Like, no, I didn't make a fortune from this, but, I made a good salary and I had very rewarding work. And even though there were moments that were unbelievably stressful and miserable and torturous and difficult and disappointing and challenging, they were a great life experience when I reflect on it. Now that I'm not like suffering through the end of the financial failure of the business. And that really was powerful for me because it recast a lot of things. I mean, I've been involved in many companies that were successful and many companies that were failures. And, many of the successes I've been marginally involved in, like, I didn't have much to do with the success other than I showed up at the right time with a check. Others, I was deeply involved in the success and vice versa. There were some failures where, I wasn't really that involved in the business. And there are others where I was one of the principals that resulted in the company ultimately failing, whether I was an investor or an entrepreneur. So on all spectrums of that, in that, and I just saw a note, can I take one last question? Sure, I'm happy to do one last if Amos is happy to keep things running. But I'll end this statement with, when I reflect on that arc, sure, one could say, Brad, it's easy for you because you've had more successes than failures. You've got plenty of financial resources. You're very healthy. You're successful. Da, da, da. Sure, absolutely. All of those things are true. I'm operating and saying this from a very privileged position. And I accept that. But at the same time, if you look at that long arc, there's an enormous amount of real challenge and struggle in that long arc and financial failure in that long arc. And I no longer view that as failure. I view that as part of the long arc of the experience that I get to have while I'm on this planet, where one day it will end.
Yeah, to your point from before, the journey, not the destination.
Bingo.
Yeah. Yeah. If you have time to take that one last question, that's great. And then we could wrap it up after that.
Yeah. And I saw some other stuff scrolled up as I posted. Sometimes I can follow it. Sometimes I can't. Today I wasn't able to follow it because I was not engaged. So for those people who had texted earlier, things, thank you. If folks had kind words and if people gave me feedback that was critical, please send it again. Email me, brad@feld.com, with any critical feedback that says, hey, Brad, I thought you were way off on this. That's how I learn. This last question, is there a framework to understand one's relationship with time and how can one change it? This is not a 1-minute answer, but
no, this is an hour and 12 itself.
But it's awesome. And I'm actually going to leave you. I'm going to leave you with a taste of what I've been playing around with in the last 6 months. And I took a vacation this summer from writing on my blog at Feld.com. I hadn't done that for more than a couple of weeks, or maybe I'd done it for a month. And I just decided I wasn't going to write from the beginning of summer to the end of summer. And I still haven't started writing again. I'll pick it back up in a couple of weeks. I'm starting to find my emails to other people getting longer and longer. So it's time for me to write some blog posts again. But one of the things I started to think about a lot earlier, it was last September, was time. And I was thinking about time in the context of finite time. And I have a deeply held belief. I'm independent of whatever your religious or spiritual beliefs. I personally believe that when you die, it's over. And I don't know what that means. I have no idea what that means. But I just operate from the perspective that the instantiation of this particular consciousness that I embody as Brad Feld is done when I die. Again, no judgment on any other belief system, but I'm operating from that perspective. And so at 55 going on 56, like I'm getting pretty aware that my time is finite and that I've got less of it in front of me than behind me. Likely there's some fantasy narrative of, immortality. It's a fantasy narrative that human beings have been chasing since the beginning of time, and, an essential component of all religious beliefs and spiritual beliefs. But, okay, I'm not going to operate today based on that. Amy and I, by the way, have this thing that was on the guy that writes Wait But What, which is just an awesome every now and then blog post. It used to be more regular. He created a map. It's a wall hanging that the horizontal is weeks and the vertical is years. And he starts at age 0 and goes to age 90. And every intersection is a box. And you unroll it. It's a poster size thing and you stare at it and you go, holy shit. Like every week that ticks by is another one of those fucking boxes, and I'm running out of boxes. Like 90 is a pretty good life. I'd like to live to 90. Like starting to ponder stuff like that. For me, one of the things that I did to change my relationship with time, which I have struggled knowing that time is finite. In other words, it's my relationship. I can't change time, but I can change how I relate to it. Is I've tried so many tactics over the years. I eventually came up with a thing that came out of a therapy session, but I think it was also prompted by Amy and conversations with Amy. Everyone in my world that I talk to about this, that's a contemporary, not everyone, almost everyone in my world that's a contemporary that I talk to about this kind of goes down the path of what are you going to do next? And kind of goes down the path of saying, you know, the only way you're going to figure out what you're going to do next is to stop doing what you're doing now. There's like that narrative in the ethos. That's not how I've lived my life, really my whole adult life. Everything I've ever done, everything new that I started, there was always transitional overlap with whatever I did previously. I have never had the experience of leaving a job, not having a to-do list the next day, and taking time off and then starting a new job. I've never had that experience. Everything's always had overlaps, multiple overlaps, and continuity in my own experience. And so it just doesn't ring true to me when people say, what are you going to do next? I'm like, I don't fucking know. When somebody says, well, what do you want to do next? I'm like, I don't fucking know. That's not how my brain works. And well, when are you going to stop doing what you're doing? I'm like, that's not how my brain works. Like, I don't know. I can't relate to the question. What I've done, what I started doing about a year ago, and it's been very powerful for me, was I decided rather than managing my time, I was going to compress into the smallest box possible of time the things I didn't want to spend time on. And I say compress into the smallest box possible or crunch into a box. I knew that I could not compress the things I didn't want to spend time on to zero. That's life. Like you're always going to have to spend time on things you don't want to do. But I could compress them into the smallest possible box. I could choose to spend as much as my time as possible on the things I wanted to spend my time on and have that crowd out everything else. I have great affection for Amos. I have great affection for Techstars. It's very easy for me to show up for an hour and 7 minutes, once a day, not twice a day, not 3 times a day, not 17 times a day, which, by the way, sometimes when I'm not paying attention to it, my assistant will all of a sudden schedule 2 of these or 3 of these. And I don't want that. I don't want to do 3 of these a day. That doesn't give me energy, but 1 does. And 1 is fun. And I don't want to do this with somebody random who I don't care about, but I would do it with somebody random who I've never met before if I care about what they're doing. So I'm not really interested in doing this on pick your famous, high visible, whatever thing. I'm happy to do this with people who are entrepreneurial, who are trying to actually get other entrepreneurs to engage in a meaningful way. And I don't care if 14 people show up, 93 people show up, 500 people show up. It's the people that are here right now is what gives me energy. And so when I get the, hey, we'd like to hire you to do this thing for this big company that we don't care about, or that I don't care about, to do this thing, my answer is, no, thank you. If Techstars calls me and says, hey, can you please do this thing for this big company that we've got a partnership with? My answer is absolutely. Right? So it's changing my relationship with time by being really clear about how I'm spending it. I'll end with then, in the last 6 months, if you, I log all my reading on Goodreads. I'm a huge reader. I read probably 2 to 3 books a week, 100 plus books a year on regularly. My wife is a huge reader. We don't have kids. And so it's one of the big things that we spend our time on. If you go to Goodreads and find me, you can see my books. And I log all my books in reverse chronological order. And I give everyone a 5. I think the ranking system on all the social everything is bullshit. And I know how hard it is to write a book. So I give every author an appreciation for the effort that they put into writing the book by giving them a 5. the good books, the books that I think are really important, I write a post on my blog. But you can see what I've been reading. One of the things that I got into in the last year started off as a couple of things I read by, Nobel Prize level physicists about quantum physics. Not so much because I was into quantum computing, although we made an investment in quantum computing, but because I was kind of curious from a layperson's perspective, how I could deconstruct some of the stuff that was now going on. As I started to read, and several of the books I read were unbelievable, again, from a layperson's perspective, I went deeper into this. And I started to realize pretty quickly that nobody actually understands anything about quantum physics. That's part of the beauty of quantum physics. It then gets better as you unfold it, is that the deepest and most capable quantum physicists today are actually cross between quantum physicists and philosophers. And a number of physicists have become writers and philosophers. And in some cases, it's the extreme. A good example is Alan Lightman, who was a physicist, a physics professor at MIT, who's now a writer. He wrote a book. His first book was Einstein's Dreams, a beautiful, beautiful book. His current writing is just, it's off the hook. It's extraordinary in terms of provoking thought about what is meaning. All right, we're circling all the way back. Like, what is meaning? Well, how does quantum physics relate to meaning? That's a whole fucking show. Like, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to come up and figure out what all this is and how it means. And, the idea that we're now dealing with structures, infinitesimal structures that we can't even conceptualize, that are being measured, what's happened to them that happened 1 billion years ago because of the way that time and light work, to the size of the universe where people say, we don't actually even understand what this construct is. It might not actually be the right construct based on how things do things. I've been reading about that the last 6 months. It doesn't get you into scary hippie crazy land, although interestingly, some of the really great stuff was written in the 60s and the 70s and traces back to people like Alan Watts and others that were, the crazy hippie philosophers that were really provocative. Like, that intersection at that moment of time was wild. But it relates back to this question of time. It's like, what does it even mean? And I think as, entrepreneurs and humans, we get stuck in this, like, we have to achieve this, we have to accomplish this, this is what we have to do, this is how we're measured for success, this is how our parents programmed us, this is how we grew up, this is how our society wires us, this is what our religion tells us, this is what I learned in school, this is what my friends do that I have to do. These are my own chemical dynamics that cause me to behave the way I behave. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. These are the horrible things that happened to me. These are the wonderful things that happened to me. This is the environment I was born into randomly. And so I got lucky with health or unlucky. I got lucky with, the color of my skin or not. I got lucky with the place I was born or not. I got lucky with the resources my parents had or not. And I use the word lucky with, I'm on a spectrum, whatever those spectrums are. And by the way, there's almost an infinite number of those things too. And it all cycles back down to, well, what does any of this mean? And in some ways, that's why Dave and I wrote the book in the first place, was to try to provoke people to write, to think about that, not to just blindly go forward. I'll end with that.
Yeah, that was awesome, Brad. I feel like I could go on for a while, but I will, I'm going to end it here. Say thank you so much. I'm going to follow up with you, and maybe I have some more questions that I'll email you as well.
Anytime. And I tossed my email address there. I'm happy to be on the receiving end of emails. My only request is start with the punchline. Don't make me wade through 6 paragraphs to get to what you want. Just be direct. Like, hey, Brad, I heard you on Amos's thing. I need help with blah, or I have a question about blah, or you said this and here's what my thought was, or you said this and I think you're crazy and here's why. And I'll be quick to respond, and I'm very good at the 1 sentence and 1 word response. If I can help, I will, and if I won't or don't think I can, I will say so.
Cool. Dude, thank you so much, man. It was great to see you. And thank you everybody for joining us today.